We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Leslie Braxick, and I'm a member of the steering committee. I just want to welcome everyone here today and just thank you for coming on this to hear about a very, very important topic, hate and polarization in Central and Eastern Europe. In light of the size of the group, we're not going to use the QR code for question and answer. Just raise your hand the old-fashioned method, and we will just take questions that way. And I'll, at this point, really just to get us started, hand it over to the moderator, Michael Duffin. He's the senior advisor for the Bureau of Counterterrorism in the U.S. Department of State. And Michael will will moderate the session and then also make sure the other panelists are introduced. So thank you for being here. And Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Everyone can hear me. Hate knows no borders, and this discussion, it's going to focus on an important region in the world that's often overlooked in terms of violent white supremacy, or what we at the U.S. Department of State call racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, or REMV. That is Central and Eastern Europe. Before we go to our panelists, we're going to have some opening remarks by Mr. Ian Moss, who is the Deputy Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Counterterrorism. Ian, please.
Mike is our resident expert, and much of the good work that we're doing at the State Department related to REMV wouldn't be possible without him. He is just an extraordinarily valuable member of our team. But I just wanted to thank everyone. I'm really impressed by the dedication and passion of all the speakers at this summit, and everything that they've demonstrated towards combating hate. This includes, of course, the speakers for this panel, which was inspired by the work that the State Department is doing to counter the transnational dimensions of racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, and an effort that has been supercharged since the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration. In the wake of the attack on Muslim worshippers at two mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand in March 2019, investigators found a trail of breadcrumbs the perpetrator left across Central and Eastern Europe while meeting other white supremacists and visiting sites of religious and ethnic strife in the year 2018. Although the perpetrator of the Christchurch attack, Brenton Tarrance, travels to this region, likely did not yield anything of value in terms of his tactical ability, he certainly found inspiration and support from among a number of individuals who shared his twisted ideology. In Hanau, Germany, in February 2020, a 43-year-old white supremacist who obtained weapons training at a commercial facility in Slovakia opened fire on two shisha bars in a racially motivated attack, killing 9 people before killing his mother and himself. These are just 2 examples of the transnational nature, origins, and connections that attend the REMV threat. It is critical that we learn more about these transnational connections of REMV groups and individuals, whether they are operational or just simply aspirational. As our panelists will discuss, REMV actors across Europe and around the world have traveled to several countries in Central and Eastern Europe to participate in neo-Nazi concerts, whites-only mixed martial arts tournaments, paramilitary training, marches, and rallies. Frequently, REMV actors assault their victims with knives, clubs, and fists rather than bombs or guns, which attracts less public attention and makes it harder to obtain reliable data to quantify this threat. This is why engaging government and civil society stakeholders in Central and Eastern Europe is a critical part of the State Department's efforts to counter REMV globally. I would like to touch on some of these efforts briefly. In May, in partnership with the government of Germany, the Department of State, and the Department of Justice, launched in Berlin the Counterterrorism Law Enforcement Forum. Over the course of 2 days, law enforcement officials, criminal justice practitioners, and diplomats from more than 30 countries joined experts from several multilateral and civil society organizations to discuss ways to increase focus, awareness, and information exchanges to counter REMV actors and groups. This important forum will be held annually. Last October, working with the Strong Cities Network, the State Department sponsored a workshop in Bratislava, Slovakia, for local government officials and practitioners. This was the first ever RIMV-focused workshop Strong Cities Network and the State Department organized in the region, but it won't be the last. In November, Strong Cities will host, this coming November, Strong Cities will host a follow-up workshop in Bratislava. This time, including local and national government officials and practitioners from Austria, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, the Republic of Georgia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and of course, Slovakia. In addition to the workshop, we are supporting small grants and a virtual working group that is building a regional cohort of practitioners who are better equipped to identify the warning signs of radicalization and recruitment to violence. We also partnered with Norway to sponsor the Global Counterterrorism Forum RIMV Toolkit, which we'll discuss during a panel discussion in the next session. Further, we have supported the Invent to Prevent Countering Hate and Intolerance program in Slovakia and other countries outside of the region. Similar to the DHS-funded Invent to Prevent and the peer-to-peer Facebook Global Digital Challenge programs, this initiative empowers students to develop online and offline campaigns to push back against hate and intolerance on their educational campuses and in their communities. We plan to expand Invent to Prevent to additional countries next year. We have also sent former white supremacists who have renounced hate on speaker programs to countries such as Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and Slovakia to engage journalists, policymakers, practitioners, and youth about the threat of white supremacist violence. In 2016, we sent former neo-Nazi skinhead Kristen Picciolini to Slovakia. Picciolini's visit helped serve as a wake-up call to the dangers of RIMV, particularly as some of these actors are seeking to enter government. Picciolini was also one of the attendees of the United We Stand Summit President Biden convened at the White House just last week in response to numerous incidents of hate-fueled violence in the United States, including the racially motivated supermarket attack in Buffalo in May. I cannot overstate the importance of President Biden and other elected leaders dousing the flames of hatred, bigotry, and xenophobia, not fanning them. Before I conclude, I want to stress the need for greater collaboration between experts from North America and Western Europe and engagement with counterparts in Central and Eastern Europe. RIMV actors have been traveling to this region for years, including 2 white supremacists from the United States who committed anti-Semitic acts at the site of the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland just last month. This panel, featuring prominent experts from Poland and the United States, is an example of the collaboration and cooperation that is necessary if we were to stop hate in its tracks. I thank everybody again, and Mike, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian. Our first speaker, we're gonna have each of the panelists give opening statements of 2 to 3 minutes, and then we're going to go into a discussion. And instead of submitting questions via the app or the QR code, we're just going to have you, since it's an intimate audience, just raise your hand after the opening statements, and we'll have an interactive discussion. Our first speaker to my left is Dr. Rafal Pankowski, a sociologist and professor who's based out of Warsaw. And can we please go to the first slide, the next slide? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be part of this panel at the Global Summit, and I think this panel is helping the summit live up to its name. I think this discussion is making the summit a little more global. And of course, the context is very special when discussing about the issue of extremism in Central and Eastern Europe. It is the context of the war in Ukraine. And I would like to start by paying tribute to the people of Ukraine and all the innocent victims of the war. And I think the war in Ukraine really shows us what the politics of hate and authoritarianism leads to. Ultimately, it leads to mass violence and mass suffering. But we must not forget also about the other big part of the context in the region, which is what we may refer to as democratic backsliding, or a crisis of democratic culture and democratic values, which is not going away. And I think when we talk about the war and we talk about the democratic backsliding, I think when talking about either of them, we we must not forget about the other. And that's one thing I wanted to state here. One other thing I wanted to mention is the Independence Day March in Warsaw, because I think it is a good example of the much bigger phenomenon which has been called the internationalization of extremism, or the paradoxical internationalization of extreme nationalism. The event in Warsaw is also an example of what happens when hate goes unchecked. It started as a small event back in 2009 with just about 500 participants, mostly racist skinheads, who marched through the center of Warsaw. In 2010, I remember witnessing the gathering, which had about 3,000 participants. And I was thinking that's a big number. And of course, I was very naive because the event became bigger and bigger every year. And in the last years, it has effectively become the biggest extreme right gathering anywhere in Europe, and I think beyond Europe too, which is no longer just a Polish event, but it draws an international crowd. Just about every extreme right and racist group from Europe, and in many cases from outside Europe, they go to Warsaw on the 11th of November, the main Polish holiday, which doesn't really make me proud, I'm afraid. And I think this is the kind of event that we can symbolically call a super spreader event. And I think we can also explain it to the American audience as Charlottesville on steroids, because in the last years it draws, well, more than 100,000 participants. Not all of them are right-wing extremists, but it is very clear who the organizers are. These are far-right groups whose very names, the All Polish Youth and the National Radical Camp, go back to anti-Semitic violent groups that existed in Poland in the 1930s. And one more thing I would like to mention in the context of the Independence Day in Independence Day March in Warsaw is the issue of reaction from the mainstream society. I already mentioned that a lot of the participants of the march are not right-wing extremists, but they are drawn to it. The distinction between the mainstream politics and the radical extremist right in Poland has been blurred in recent years. And I think it's a big mistake for the Polish Ministry of Culture and National Heritage to actually subsidize financially one of the organizations that is behind the march, the Independence March Association. I think it is a big mistake, and it is discussed a lot in Polish public opinion. But we must not forget that this is not the only nationalist march with international participation that takes place in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. There are other marches. There is one in Budapest. There is one in Bulgaria. There are other events which are not as big as the one in Warsaw, but nevertheless they are similar in the sense that these are events organized by extremists with the participation of extremists from other countries across and beyond the region of Central and Eastern Europe. I think that is probably more than enough for starters, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Rafal. And our next speaker, Marilyn Mayo of the Anti-Defamation League, will touch a little bit on that as well. Next slide, please. And Marilyn, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here, and I'm giving a little bit of the American perspective on this issue. I'm a senior research fellow at ADL, at the Anti-Defamation League, and at the ADL, we're really concerned about international extremism, and particularly how extremists in the U.S. are networking, with their counterparts abroad, and the tactics and strategies that they're sharing and how they influence each other's ideology. And we've seen white supremacists from the US, for example, go to the independence march in Poland, particularly in 2019, before COVID, right? So it's like, we haven't seen it in more recent years because of COVID, but in 2019 you had two major white supremacist groups that went from the United States that went to the march. And that's Patriot Front, which is a group that's one of the most active white supremacist groups in the US all across the country. And the other group was called Identity of Europa, which is now defunct, but the person who was in charge of that group, Patrick Casey, is still active in the white supremacist movement. And we know that white supremacists look at countries in Eastern Europe like Poland, like Hungary, other countries, Serbia, as models for white Christian, what they call white Christian values, and also admire them for rejecting immigrants from the Middle East and Africa, particularly during the Syrian refugee crisis. And I want to pivot a little bit and touch on something else that's of concern to us, which is that we have groups like more conservative groups in the US that are turning to countries like mostly more like Hungary, but I think Poland can fall into that category too. But for the most part, embracing the nationalism that we're seeing coming out of those countries, the authoritarianism, and for example, and I think really what's of tremendous concern is that they're doing it for some of the same reasons that the white supremacists are doing it, right? Because they see those countries as models of preserving white Christian values, of being against multiculturalism, against diversity. And so, for example, the American Conservative Union, which is one of the most established conservative organizations in the US, they held their Conservative Political Action Conference in Budapest and featured Viktor Orban and other leaders from far-right parties in Europe. And they also invited Viktor Orban to come speak in August in Dallas for their conference. And he was the keynote speaker and talked about woke societies and promoting like Christian conservatism and preserving Western civilization, which is often a euphemism for, again, that we see white nationalists use to preserve white Christian culture. So this is, again, of tremendous concern. And I'm going to stop there because I want us to get to questions, but these are the two areas that are of most concern right now.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. Next, to her left is Dr. Kasper Reykjavik from the University of Oslo's Center on Research
on Extremism.
Excuse me, yes. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the organizers for having me. Thank you all for coming, and then really happy to be on this panel. I'll explain what this slide is about in a second, but Marilyn alluded to the fact that quite a few people in the West see this part of Europe, and I'm also Polish, by the way, but it's the only time I use the word Poland on this panel, don't worry. There are way better experts here than me on this. They see our region as a kind of a Shangri-La, the place where you can be yourself. Whether that's the case, I'm not sure. And I want to just put two ironies on the table here. The first irony is that when I spoke to a far-right individual from Ukraine, I mostly look at Ukraine, he told me that he's kind of confused because in the past, he had to check what the American far-right people are wearing, listening to, and how they're behaving. Now it's the other way around. They come to me, and they ask me what to do, and I'm not sure that I can be a role model. We Central Eastern Europeans, we're a bit shy, and especially if a Westerner comes to us and wants to us to be the role model, as a role model, well, that's a unique situation for us. So this is the point, the first irony that I want to put on the table. I'm not sure that the far rights of the region are 100% ready for being the role models. They are asked to step up, but I'm not sure that's the case. And I'll give you an example. On the left, in the slide that you see, it's actually a Telegram channel snapshot of the Azov movement. You might have heard of Azov in the United States because apparently at some point they were a candidate to be added on the foreign terrorist organizations list.
No comment.
Of course, you cannot comment on that, Michael. But you know, whether that merits this, that's a completely different matter. So Azov says, come and join us in the war in Ukraine. I mean, Russia-Ukraine war. And they put out this call, and they are allegedly this horribly dangerous organization, and they recruit that many people in the photo that you see. I've interviewed 4 of them, so I can tell you that I have a pretty good grasp of this issue. Now, apparently 20,000 people expressed a want, a need to go and fight for Ukraine, not just far-right individuals. 20,000. They recruited that many. Have they stepped up? Are they ready? Are they a player? That's probably up to us to discuss on this panel as well. So, you know, on one hand, you will see those images that we've seen from Warsaw and from other places, from Budapest, because I believe the other photo, Marilyn, was from Budapest. And on the other hand, you have this. Then the second irony that I just wanted to point out to you is that quite a lot of the friends of this organization that tried to recruit fighters for Ukraine in this war, far right, you know, foreign fighters, who, you know, really sounds horrific. Quite a lot of their friends in the West are actually pro-Russian. And they cannot fathom fighting against Vladimir Putin, who is a traditionalist, anti-LGBT, anti-liberal leader, and an orthodox person who has this whole spirituality that we allegedly don't have, neither of us does. You know, it's kind of hard to fight him. You know, he is the guy. We want to be like him. We want to be like Russia. Then why would I join and fight against him? And that leads me to the conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, that quite a lot of this that we're discussing here, and Rafał alluded to that, is connected to Russia. This summit is called Eradicate Hate. And certainly the country, Russia, is spawning quite a lot of hate at the very moment. So let's not forget the elephant in the room, and it's quite a big elephant. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Kasper. Next slide, please. And the last panelist that's present here, and we have video remarks for a panelist who wasn't able to make it here, Katarzyna Wlodkowska, who's a journalist from the Polish newspaper Gazeta, and she's going to, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm Katarzyna Włodkowska. I'm a reporter for Gazeta Wyborcza. It's Poland's leading liberal newspaper. I've been in professional for 17 years. My main focus is social and criminal injustice, and I was invited here, which is really a huge privilege for me. Thank you, Michael, because of my cover story from January 2020. It was investigative report about the assassin of the president of Gdańsk, Mr. Paweł Adamowicz, who was stabbed in the heart on a scene during the largest charity event in Poland. The assassin, the killer, 27-year-old man, was released from prison a month before, and the reason why he chosen Mr. Adamowicz to kill was, as happened here in Pittsburgh, the hate speech. The year before, in 2018, we had in Poland local elections, and Gdańsk is one of the most important cities on the politician map. I will explain you now why. First, Civic Platform, the largest centrist opposition party in Poland, was found in the city in Gdańsk. Donald Tusk, the leader of the group, is from Gdańsk. Third, the Law and Justice, who ruled the country since 2015, never won in a city. And last, Paweł Adamowicz was the perfect target. With other few mayors, he invited to our city refugees. After years of being traditionalist and conservative, he became quite liberal and progressive. He decided to support the LGBT community and was the first Polish politician who proposed the legalization on one of the biggest national groups in Poland. Those groups are highly supported by the Polish government. As Rafał pointed out, they received lots of money. If someone will bring accusation against them to the prosecutor office often chooses to not react. Even when one of these groups published the public death certificates of Paweł Adamowicz and other few mayors who welcomed refugees. And And public television, to build the impression that Paweł Adamowicz is a pure evil, made during the 2018 almost 1,800 materials about him, and it averaged 5 times a day. And they suggested he was serving German interest, not Polish. They accusing him from promoting Nazism, had been called a thief, betrayer, mafioso, and many times didn't even ask him about any comment. And as we know from the perspective of psychology, perpetrators of such crimes are many times people with various types of disorders. And politician ideology, media message, chain of hate in social media can inspire them or direct even their aggression towards a particular object. And the killer, after he killed Mr. Adamowicz, he announced that he did it to get revenge on civic platform because, in his opinion, they put him unjustly to the prison. Of course, there was nothing unjust in it. He was in a prison for a couple of robberies. He was filmed by this action, so there was no doubt. But that was revenge. But the thing is, Mr. Adamowicz, 4 years earlier, he decided to leave civic platform. So what's the point why the killer chose him? And as I proved in my report, in a prison, the killer had access to public television, watched this, and many times talk about Mr. Adamowicz the way as he seen it in public television. And to understand the whole situation, I will explain you just only one context. The killer didn't choose this charity event while he killed coincidentally. The Great Orchestra of Christmas, I think we do not have any other event who received so much hate during last years. The orchestra critics and, of course, public media hate this because they are leftist, tiny bit anarchist, definitely not on a government side, LGBT friendly, so in their opinion, anti-Polish. And the same situation is with the judges system. Judges are accused of being a group above the law, a caste above the law even, some corrupt group that should be replaced. So the killer behind the bars was watching news about bad guys and the necessity of the radical solutions. So he went out angry at the opposition party, its ex-member and judges system. And after Paweł Adamowicz died, a couple journalists announced that in their opinion, public television has moral responsibility for this tragedy. Of course, public television sued them, and last year, court announced in a verdict that we have a right to say that. And the saddest conclusion of this story is that barely anything changed. And now we have even worse situation, and the public media has another target. But I hope there's going to be possibility to talk about it too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our final panelist who was unable to be here, Rob Williams from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, did record video remarks, and so we would like to play them now, please.
It's my pleasure to join you today, albeit recording in a dimly lit hotel room due to an emergency. In the next few minutes, I'm going to tee up some discussion for the panel by addressing a key issue that faces the fight against anti-Semitism, particularly in some parts of Central and Eastern Europe: denial and distortion of the Holocaust. What do I mean by these terms? Well, Holocaust denial is somewhat easier to wrap our heads around. It's an attempt to convince people that the Holocaust and occasionally related atrocities never happened. Holocaust deniers really only have two goals: to make anti-Semitism acceptable and to provide legitimacy for fascism. This means that denial is anti-Semitism, full stop. It's a problem. but it is a considerably less common problem in our parts of the world today than Holocaust distortion. Holocaust distortion is an attempt to excuse, minimize, or otherwise misrepresent the Holocaust, both as something historical and as something that has relevance today. It's tricky because distortion does not deny the reality of the Holocaust necessarily, and it's also difficult to identify the motives behind it. Is someone distorting for cynical, hateful reasons, or because they don't know the facts? Well, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Think of it this way. On a moral level, distortion is an insult to the memories of victims and survivors. And on a practical level, it can act as a gateway drug, if you will, to conspiracy theory, to outright Holocaust denial, and to more dangerous forms of anti-Semitism. Distortion takes on many forms. Sometimes it's an inappropriate comparison to the Holocaust, something we've become well familiar with over the course of the COVID pandemic. Sometimes it's an effort to twist the Holocaust in order to radicalize or sow confusion. In short, it can be innocent, it can be innocuous, and it can be intentional. And it can also come from governments. On this last point, consider, if you will, what we've seen coming from the Russian Federation for a number of years. Rhetoric that misuses the Holocaust in ways that justify Russian aggression, something we've seen especially before and during the invasion of Ukraine. Sometimes it's unsophisticated, like signs appearing on bus stops in Moscow saying Sweden's run by Nazis. Other times it comes from the highest echelons of power, like when Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said, quote, wise Jewish people, say that the most ardent anti-Semites are Jews, end quote. But these things are not unique just to Russia, as our panelists will soon discuss. So I'm going to use my remaining time to address a particular form of distortion, something that I'll call rehabilitation. It's an umbrella term to describe attempts to heroize, whitewash, or otherwise restore the reputations of persons and occasionally organizations complicit in Holocaust-era crimes. This is an international phenomenon, one not unique just to former Axis powers. It can happen in countries that were occupied by the Axis, countries that were neutral during the war, and in countries that were part of the alliance, including the United States. It is a shared problem that demands a common and international solution. At times, the so-called rehabilitated benefit through official processes like a high court overturning a long-past judicial sentence. I'll give you an example. In 1946, a Nazi collaborator named Leon Rupnik was captured, tried, and hanged for his crimes. In January 2020, the Slovenian Supreme Court overturned Rupnik's death sentence. Now, he's dead, but because the court overturned his death sentence on a technicality, it brings with it a risk that Rupnik could be seen by some as an absolved hero in certain segments of society. But courts aren't always necessary. Other times, parliaments have taken official action. We've seen this again and again in a number of Eastern European countries like Ukraine, Lithuania, Bulgaria, and others. There, many of the rehabilitated are being elevated because they were part of the anti-Soviet resistance. But some of these individuals also collaborated with the Nazis in crimes against Jews, Roma, ethnic Poles, and other groups. Persons like Roman Shukevich in Ukraine, for example. Other times, individuals have undergone cultural rehabilitation because they were well-known authors or artists. Some are protected by religious authorities. Others are erased from historical discussion entirely. Think of the Russian Liberation Army in this case. Others went on to fame after the war. To this list, we could include some of those Nazi scientists brought to the United States to work on our rocket program. There are even cases of rehabilitation outside particular national contexts. Think of the popularity of the writings of the Italian fascist ideologue Julius Evola among extreme right groups in North America, or the fact that you can buy the scribblings of the Belgian SS officer Léon de Grelle in legitimate bookstores in parts of Eastern Europe. Well, what do we do about this? We could decide to do nothing, but then we risk signaling that some actions and ways of thinking are excusable, and our common agreement rejects this. While it's always possible to forgive an individual for her or his sins, we cannot forgive deeds, and, in this case at least, the atrocities of the Holocaust violated our shared moral principles. So to achieve a better balance, we need history, a history that seeks a better understanding and relationship with the past in order to bring about a more peaceable present and future. And we cannot achieve this if we only see the Holocaust through a warped lens. Clarity will require that we ensure that legal and political rehabilitation come to an end, both in our country and abroad, that we engage with history in ways that reach non-specialists, and that we realize that the safety of a shared international future rests on a relationship with the past that sees it not as we hope it might have been, but rather as it actually was. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing the outcomes of this conference and this discussion.
Great. Next slide, please. Given that we have about 19 minutes remaining, I'm going to ask one question for all the panelists. If you could please, we could start with Katarzyna and move this way. In a minute or less, I want to discuss why does Central and Eastern Europe matter? And I say, why does it matter in terms of hate and polarization? We're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the United States. And for some people, I'm sure we're all well-traveled people in the audience, but for those who have never been to Slovakia or Poland or Hungary or Ukraine, why does what happens far away matter here or in Canada or in Western Europe?
Why the situation, the story in Gdańsk is important, yes?
Yes, yes.
You know, I'm thinking about this since yesterday because before I came here, I had totally different answers. And since I'm here, I realized that we have some basic stuff to do again. Because like I thought at the end of my speech, now the public television has a new target. It's Donald Tusk, the leader of Civic Platform, which they accuse him almost about everything, called a betrayer, enemy of people. One of the materials of Donald Tusk even was accompanied with photos of Stalin and Hitler. And after this material, one of the columnists wrote, "It would be best for law and justice to shoot Tusk 3 months before the elections." Of course, later he explained that was a metaphor, but it's difficult to think about it like that. And I think the story shows us because I realized like we lost 7 years. I mean, those 7 years since Law and Justice ruled the country. Civic Platform is a very big group. They have huge public money and they can create lots of like networks, groups. They can support scientists. I think they really lost those of 7 years. Even in preparation from this conference, I called to the spokesman of Civic Platform and asked him, "Are you doing anything with this? Did you suit for at least once for hatred public television?" And I couldn't have gotten more surprising answer because it seems they didn't. And when I asked why, he told me that they are afraid that it will seem that they are weak if they will start fighting. And so I think the lesson is like, for me, the lesson, I'm thinking what I should do, because I just realized that like I know what is lesson for me. I will come back from this conference. I will write an article. I will publicly ask a Civic Platform why you're not doing nothing, and I will maybe propose some basic stuff that we can't ignore any act of hate speech, and the basic stuff is to name it and react. And I was wondering, maybe we are in a point, maybe not even only in Polish, that something bad is happening with us, that we tiny got used to it. That such things are happening. So.
Yeah, really quickly, thank you, Michael, for that. I would say we would probably all agree in the room that Western Europe is important to the United States. So do not think of us as Central Eastern Europe. Don't call us Eastern Europe, by the way. Do us the favor. Do us a favor. At least do Central Eastern Europe. Think of us as a soft underbelly of Western Europe. You're talking EU member states. You're talking NATO countries. That's why it's important. Plus, quite a few of us live amongst you. Our problems are also your problems and vice versa, believe it or not. There's quite a few Poles around in this area as well. So it's kind of like, to ask about the connection, it's obvious in this sense.
Yeah. Marilyn?
So I think your slide says it all. The mainstreaming of hate is an incredible trend that we're seeing in the United States, and I think it's happening in Europe as well. But I'll point to just a couple of examples of some things that we're seeing. Tucker Carlson, who has probably one of the greatest listening audiences on Fox News, he's gone to Hungary a number of times and has broadcast his show from there. He did a video for one of the CPAC conferences that I mentioned. He has consistently talked about Hungary, for example, as a model for the United States, but we're also seeing that this promotion of American nationalism from the far right and using countries in Central Europe as a model, that some of the vitriol that we're seeing against, for example, the LGBTQ community is something that has really emerged in a very virulent way in the last year. But we know that this is also happening in countries like Hungary in particular, and Poland as well, and other places. And it's in the framework of this idea of a nationalism and creating this, a country of traditional roles and traditional cultures, and that means that a community like the LGBTQ community or progressive, that they're not included in that. And so I think we're seeing this across the board, in that different countries are learning from each other about this mainstreaming of hatred towards groups that they don't want to accept into their society. So I'll stop there, but there's also I guess one more thing to add is that when I mentioned the conference in Hungary, another thing that happened in Hungary is that a group of young conservatives, and they were from two different groups, Young Republicans, which is a very long-established group in the country, and Republicans for National Renewal, which is a new group, invited all these nationalist parties, like ultra-nationalist parties, to this event called, it was an event about Western renewal. And I think it's really important to say that it was all these youth parties from different countries that met together, and they made a statement, and the statement was, about traditional, that there should be traditional roles, that that countries should focus on nationalism, and be, and that they shouldn't let in immigrants. So this is something. So we're just seeing these common themes emerge from all these different, far-right populist parties and also ultra-nationalist parties.
And I want to point out that the photos up there on the left, these are senior government officials, one from Slovakia, one from Poland, and so these are individuals who have had connections to the violent far right in their respective countries, and a few years later became senior government officials for their countries. Rafal?
Well, there are two things I would like to highlight in addition to what the other speakers already mentioned. One is obviously the impact that right-wing extremist ideas emanating from countries such as Hungary or Poland may have on the diaspora communities elsewhere. That includes the US, that includes Canada, that includes the UK. And we know there is a lot of evidence showing this impact is actually real, especially in terms of anti-Semitic propaganda that has an audience among those communities. And our organization, Never Again, has looked at this issue for a number of years, and we have collected enough evidence to, well, that's enough for me to say we are worried about that. And another thing is more general. Well, certainly countries such as Hungary or Poland could be seen as laboratories in many ways for the international far right, or at least points of reference. And of course, there is a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of platforms for cooperation between right-wing extremists internationally, and it's not a secret. A lot of it is made possible through social media. And for example, the Independence Day March in Warsaw still has a fan page on Facebook through which a lot of the fundraising is conducted, for example. And we know Facebook is not a Polish company. So I think the whole issue of internationalization has a very important aspect, which is social media, and Never Again works with initiatives such as Get the Trolls Out, European Observatory of Online Hate, Global Alliance Against Digital Hate and Extremism. And I think this is a very important aspect of the problem there.
Thank you. So, as I said, we have a little bit of time for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. And why don't we just, before the panelists answer, can we just we have two questions. Can you ask them, and then once the two are, you'll respond to them at the same time, please, ma'am.
Yet it seems to be missing as a component in the conversations that we're having.
Anyone who wants to respond, please keep your remarks to about 30 seconds
Yeah, I'll
each.
be very quick. Maybe so I'll respond to your point as well, because mostly. I think it's been mentioned that the migration crisis has been, and the anti-Muslimity, if you like, of that event in Central Eastern Europe was mentioned as a turbocharger, super spreader of that ideology in the region. I agree with you. We don't talk enough about the particular group that you spoke about and that you come from. From what I look at in Ukraine, interestingly, the anti-Muslim aspect of the far right there has currently died down, and all the groups that are fighting on the front line, they feature Muslim fighters to show off that it's whole world is with us. But it's no mystery that those far right groups actually were forged in the fire of actually fighting with Muslim students in cities like Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. So it is there. It's muted at the moment, but it will come back. Especially in my case, if I look at Ukraine and the Ukrainian groups, after the war hopefully ends, it will stage a return. But not the particular case that you're talking about, but generally the kind of cosmic struggle, Christians versus Muslims. It animates them absolutely. The only funny thing, inverted commas, is that there aren't just enough Muslims there in the region. That's the thing.
Rafal?
Yeah, just adding to this, there is a phrase that we have had for many years. We have heard it many times. It was coined by Paul Lenvai, I believe, anti-Semitism without Jews, meaning the Jewish community is very small, but the level of anti-Semitism can actually be very high. That applies to Poland and other countries in the region. And I think since 2015, we can definitely expand it, and we can talk about Islamophobia without Muslims. So the Muslim community in Poland has a long history, but it is very small today. But the level of Islamophobia is actually very high. So I completely agree with you also in the sense that I think that the legacy of the wars in former Yugoslavia and the genocide, as well as the denial of the genocide, that is a very important point of reference to what is happening in Central and Eastern Europe today. We must not forget. And also, in answer to your question, which I think is actually very important, yes, there are also good things about international cooperation, and my own organization, Never Again, has been very active in international networks. I mentioned some of them. I could also mention International Network Against Cyber Hate, and I could not emphasize more this importance of the social media platforms, what they do and what they don't do in response to extremism globally, but in the region of Central and Eastern Europe in particular.
If I could, I was going to say, if I could throw out an additional question for Marilyn and Katarzyna. One of the deliverables from the Eradicate Hate Summit, it's what type of action can we take from these discussions? And for me, it's important that we have more collaboration, cooperation between practitioners, researchers, journalists from North America with all of Europe and not just Western Europe. And so any suggestions, in addition to responding to the questions the audience members asked in terms of how we can collaborate more closely with you or Americans with Poles and Slovaks and others?
Well, I'll just say that I'm happy to say that Rafal and I are actually part of an international working group that's been working together for 20 years in sharing information and to develop strategies against extremism. So we just celebrated our 20th anniversary of being together in Ottawa. So I think it's incredibly important to have international cooperation on these issues because, if and the way to do it, I think that organizations that promote democracy and democratic values have to, I don't think we thought we would need this in this country, but we absolutely do right now. And I think that we need to be working with other groups that are promoting democratic values, and that's super important. And I just wanted to add one thing to the question that you asked. You've heard a lot this week about Buffalo and the Great Replacement. Well, the Great Replacement theory, was most recently promoted by Renaud Camus, a French writer who was talking about Muslim immigration to Europe. And, we I know that we talk about the Great Replacement. We especially after Buffalo, we were asked to talk about it. What does it mean? How is it impacting politics in the United States, for example? And I agree that anti-Muslim sentiment is not talked about enough, but that is part of it, and we always talk about that being part of it. And obviously, more needs to be done. And I want to give you an opportunity to, if you.
By all means, another 30 seconds is totally fine.
Okay, so how we can cooperate? I think one of the part, like for example, we spoke about it yesterday, that Polish cities should be in some kind of networks. We have at least one foundation and one good organization who is focused on hate speech. Those organizations should be highly supported and should be in some kind of bigger networking. I hope that politicians, especially opposition politicians, will understand that they have to be more engaged, and because they have really lots of public money that they can use in it. I hope that next year they're going to be here, at least one of them, to learn and build some contacts that they can use in the future. Because, and this is what I'm going to try to inspire, you need to search for sources, for practical resolutions, resolves. I don't know, you need to understand that this is one of the most important thing for us now.
Casper, 5 seconds.
For policymakers, we've talked about Russia, Ukraine, United States, and the EU, Schengen zone area. Ban these guys from coming to us, or make us ban them. Simply take away their passports, take away their assets, and it will change the game for them, believe me. It's still a reward, it's still a cherished asset. Kill it, or help us kill it.
I want to thank all of our panelists, and I want to thank you, the audience. And if you have any questions for them, by all means, say hello after we conclude this panel. Thank you so much.